be living amongst us. A new Harvard study suggested that aliens may be secretly living here on Earth.
Well, according to our next guest, aliens are already among us, and she claims to be the living proof. Kelly Tyler
Is Earth really the only planet with life, or is something else out there?
We've got different kinds of them. Charges at least 70 different species, and probably more. But yes, as odd as it sounds, there are little green men. That's not the ones we usually see, though. We see the little gray ones.
The closer we get to the end time, the stranger things are going to be. We are living in strange days. Some of them are calling them the best times that America has ever seen, the golden age of America.
The golden age of America begins right now.
Some are calling them the end of America. But the reality is our civilization, our world itself is groaning. Like a woman in travail, the Bible says, we're getting closer and closer to the birth pangs of the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. Prior to that will be the tribulation, and ultimately prior to that will be the rapture of the New Testament church. This age, as we believe it, is coming to an end. And the closer we get to the end of this age, the more the veil that has separated our world from the next is going to be pulled apart, pressed through. It's going to actually collapse. And I believe what we are seeing more and more on the headlines, which used to be in the shadows and on conspiracy websites, is the powers of darkness manifesting themselves. But what do they look like? What does satanic influence look like? What do the powers of darkness, the principalities, the spiritual wickedness in high places look like? Do they look like people dancing around a bonfire with black togas and sacrificing goats? Well, yes, but that's just your regular Tuesday night in Washington. There is a different level. And I believe if you really want to see the manifestation of the powers of darkness, you should look to religion. You should look, of course, to the Jesuits, look to politics, but you should take a long, hard look at the UFO phenomena, and specifically the abduction phenomenon. Early on in our journey at the Soul Trap, that was one of the key studies that really began to get us to see the connection of the dots, that really began to get us to realize that we spiritually are using very much the same thoughts and concepts as some in the world. It's just the medium of language is different. Where we are saying spirit, they are talking dimension. Where we are saying demon, they are talking alien. Where we are saying Satan's seed, they are talking about an ongoing alien-human hybrid breeding program. We're talking about the same thing. It's just the medium of our language is different. The writers in the know seem to be bending that way. Of course, there are still those on the History Channel or here or there that talk about little green men from the planet Reticulon, but most that have a real understanding of the phenomenon of the encounters of the third kind and the fourth kind readily believe that there's something more than just a spatial invasion. There is something dimensional, and we would say something spiritual about it. And it all seems to center around the abduction phenomenon. There is a great book that we've often mentioned here on the show called The Threat by Dr. David M. Jacobs. I want to read from chapter number 4 and give you a take that I think is very profound, shocking, and truthfully frightening. Dr. Jacobs writes in chapter 4, virtually everything that aliens do is in the service to their abduction program. Every seemingly incomprehensible or absurd alien activity has, upon examination, a logical basis. One by one, these actions have begun to lose their mystery and reveal their true purposes. When researchers first learned about the abduction phenomenon, they generally assumed that if it was real, its objective was to investigate humans. That was why aliens abducted humans. examine them, and then release them. Because this scenario occurred repeatedly, researchers, Jacobs writes, concluded that the aliens were conducting a long-term study and simply benignly collecting data. That belief gave the public a comfortable feeling because it suggested a scientific and therefore non-hostile and I would say non-spiritual, non-demonic intent. But Jacobs goes on to write, and note carefully now, we now know that the abduction phenomenon as a whole is not for the purpose of research. The evidence suggests that all the alien procedures serve a reproductive agenda. And at the heart of the reproductive agenda is the breeding program, in which the aliens collect human sperm and eggs, incubate fetuses and human hosts to produce alien-human hybrids, and cause humans to mentally and physically interact with these hybrids for the purpose of their development. Now, if you're a Bible believer, though that may sound a bit caustic to our 21st century mind, it's not that far off from some of the things that the Bible implicitly and explicitly seems to show. For instance, we find instantly that there is the wheat and the tares, which bear a similar statement of that wicked one, speaking of the tares sown among the wheat, to the similar statement mentioned of by Cain, who was of that wicked one, found in Genesis chapter number 3. Of course, we see in the book of Daniel that there is the clay and the iron, which is trying to mingle but incapable of staying together. Then, of course, there is Psalms speaking about the wicked devices. And so the question is, are we talking about Satan's seed? Are we talking about simply little green men from another planet? Or are we talking about a breeding program that looks alien in the sense of its presentation, but is in fact spiritual in the sense of its orientation? Well, Dr. Jacobs is not the only one. If you do not have this book, you are missing one of the most important books you can ever have, by Jacques Vallée, called Messengers of Deception, UFO Contacts and Cults. He writes, and we're going to read a little bit lengthy here, but I think it's very important that you get this. He says, the public is already cynical about the roles and values of government, science, and the military establishment. I would add in there also religion. The mere statement that unknown objects are penetrating our atmosphere and maneuvering at will would further erode the people's confidence in all political structure. Now, here's what he says. I think that UFOs represent an objective reality that we can study only by revolutionizing existing disciplines. Confronting the irrational means promoting pioneer research in physics and biology. We also need to begin a kind of research that will take UFO data as empirical observations and try to use them to initiate an interaction with the phenomena itself. And we should do this now before the new myth is created, before the myth of extraterrestrial revelation replaces belief in the rational acquisition of knowledge. Vallée writes, sooner or later, the emotions stored in the UFO phenomenon will be released. What kind of social reaction will appear then, he asks? There may be new churches, a la the beast, the false prophet. There may be new political movements, a la the Antichrist, Revelation chapter number 13. There may be new everything. Each sector of society will react in its own way. The temptation will be great for our technocrats to respond by building giant facilities to eavesdrop on the universe, like the multi-billion-dollar projects already proposed by some radio astronomers. Now, this is a scientist. This is a non-Christian scientist, and yet what he just described could be ripped right out of the pages of the book of Revelation, the book of Ezekiel, the book of Daniel. He goes on to say this, and this is the key thesis of his book. I propose that the UFO we see is, among other things, a device which creates a distortion of the witness's reality, that it does so for a purpose which is to project images or fabricated scenes designed to change, note what he says, our belief system. The world is hurtling to an end-time radical tectonic shift in its belief system. And it's not going to be a belief system that's going to measure anything on the Richter scale like a Donald Trump or a non-Donald Trump. It is going to be a belief system that measures catastrophically different than anything we have ever seen. Our reality, veiled by science, veiled by the Renaissance, veiled by the industrial age, is going to be torn wide open, and a new belief system is going to be fostered onto the people of this world. How much the New Testament church will see of that, that's for another discussion at another time. But it is happening, and we are getting closer and closer. He goes on to say, I believe there is a machinery of mass manipulation behind the UFO phenomenon. Now, I would change that to say, I believe there is a spiritual personality behind the UFO phenomenon. It aims at social and political goals by diverting attention from some human problems and by providing a potential release for tensions caused by others. The contactees, he states, are part of that machinery. They are helping to create a new form, here's the word again, of belief. An expectation of actual contact among large parts of the public. In turn, this expectation makes millions of people hope for the imminent realization of that age-old dream, salvation from above, surrender to the greater power of some wise navigators of the cosmos. Does that sound to you like pure just science and nuts and bolts and experiments and math, or does that sound to you like something ripped from the pages of the Bible? I submit to you that's right out of the Bible. That Valet, that Jacobs, that others are seeing what the Bible has been saying for a long time, that there is going to come an imminent realization, initially from the Antichrist, ultimately from the second advent of Christ, preliminarily from the rapture of the New Testament church. But everything we've been dealing with up until now for the last 2,000 years has been strictly horizontal. Horizontal empires, horizontal philosophies, horizontal diseases, horizontal catastrophes, horizontal. But we have run the gamut of what the horizontal can produce. Psychology can only produce a limit horizontally. Mainstream Christianity can only produce up to a certain limit horizontally. Science, politics, money, it has run its extremity in the horizon. But everyone now has nowhere else to look but up. What is a close encounter? And what are we talking about when we say that? Well, many of the cases that we study, many of the cases that we've been talking about in this show, they all bear the marks of abduction. And many of the cases that you see in encounters likewise bear the marks of an abduction. More than just seeing an alien, more than just seeing strange sights, there is an element of a close encounter. An encounter of what is called the fourth kind, where one is actually kidnapped, taken into other realms. Now, could it be in some way that the rapture of the New Testament church will be used sort of as a Arthur C. Clarke's childhood's end scenario? That in some way the great delusion of the mind at the end of the world will be in part aided by the rapture itself of a relatively few people, leaving behind far more people who claim to have the same faith of those that were just taken away. Will we see an uptick of close encounters? And as we're talking about close encounters, exactly what do we mean when we say that? Well, in basic information that you can find online, in UFOlogy, a close encounter is an event in which a person witnesses an unidentified flying object. Now that is changing. We've got UAPs and different words that they're using now. But a close encounter is an event in which someone witnesses a UFO at relatively close range, where the possibility of misidentification is presumably greatly reduced. This terminology and the system of classification behind it were first suggested in an astronomer and UFO researcher J. Allen Hynek's book, called The UFO Experience, a Scientific Inquiry, written in 1972. Categories beyond Hynek's original 3 have been added by others, but have not gained the universal acceptance, mainly because they lack the scientific rigor that Hynek aimed to bring to UFOlogy. Distance sightings, more than 150 meters or 500 feet, from the witness are classified as daylight discs, nocturnal lights, or radar visual reports. Sightings within about 150 meters or 500 feet are subclassified as various types of close encounters. Hynek and others argued that a claimed close encounter must occur within about 500 feet or 150 meters to greatly reduce or eliminate the possibility of misidentifying conventional aircraft or other known phenomena. Hynek's scale became well known after being referenced in the classic sci-fi film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which is named after the third level of the scale. Now, Hynek devised a 6-fold classification of UFO sightings, and the 6 levels are arranged according to increasing proximity. Number 1 are simply lights in the sky. It's a nocturnal event. Number 2, daylight. UFOs are seen in the daytime, generally having discoidal or oval shapes and oftentimes having some kind of visual distortion. Now, as you're going to see on the screen, there are some daylight videos that are not distorted and are not simply oval shaped. There's some strange angel-like things. There's some strange shapes out there that are being seen in the daytime. Nonetheless, the second description that he talked about was day 2, daylight observation. Third is a radar visual.
781 just sped up to 46 knots, 50 knots.
This morning, the sound of U.S. Navy sailors reacting to a radar screen tracking unidentified objects flying around their stealth ship.
UFO reports that have radar confirmation. These supposedly try to offer harder evidence that the objects are real. Well, look, we have even better than that now. We don't just have radar. We now have military jets following and videoing UFOs. Number 4 is what's called the close encounter. Visual sightings of an unidentified flying object seemingly less than 500 feet away that show an appreciable angular extension and considerable obvious reality. Number 5, a UFO event is a close encounter of the 5th kind, is a UFO event in which a physical effect is alleged. This can be interference in the functioning of a vehicle or electronic device, animals reacting, or physiological effects such as paralysis or heat. And number 6 in Hynek is the close encounter of the 6th kind, UFO encounters in which an animated entity is present. These include humanoids, robots, humans who seem to be occupants or pilots of a UFO. And we would add number 7, the number of perfection. A close encounter of the 7th kind in this particular stack would be to be actually carried away, abducted. Almost every type of encounter mentioned and listed here has already been alluded to or directly addressed in the Bible. By definition, the most extraterrestrial book on the earth is the Bible. And once you realize what has happened, to a true believer, that they are now a new creature, that they no longer belong to this terrestrial plane, it makes the whole thing even seem that much more strange. And let us forget, truth is always stranger than fiction. And the UFO phenomenon case, the UFO abduction reality, that is prepping the world. Beneath the surface of our day-to-day activities, of our clocking in and our clocking out, of our pickleball and our kids playing soccer, there is a growing mass of people that have experienced abductions, experienced close encounters of the 3rd kind, experienced close encounters of the 4th kind, and even more. He goes on to say that, and I'm going to summarize what he says. Let me summarize my conclusions thus far. UFOs are real. They are physical devices, I believe, What he should have said is they are spiritually materialistic or spiritual body devices used to affect human consciousness. They are not from outer space. Their purpose is to achieve social change on this planet. Listen to what he said. Their purpose is to achieve social change on this planet through a belief system that uses systematic manipulation of witnesses and contactees. See, that's very important that you understand this. All things trace themselves back to religion. In the Garden of Eden, ye shall be as gods. When Satan came to Christ in the temptation, fall down and worship me. The mark of the beast in Revelation 13 has nothing to do with any kind of science or vaccine or medical issue whatsoever. It has to do with those that will worship and those that will not worship. Valet is seeing it from the other side. We are seeing it from the Bible side. He said their purpose is to achieve social and spiritual change on this planet through a belief system that uses systematic manipulation of witnesses and contactees. Covert use of various sects and cults, control of the channels through which the alleged space messages can make an impact, all are used to set the stage for a coming great indescribable event. Well, it may be indescribable to those out there, but to those in the know who have the Bible, you know the indescribable, unimaginable events that are getting ready to take place. Now, when we think of abductees, of course, there are the movies and the caricatures of them. But the truth is, abductees are two things. Number one, they are far more abundant than we tend to realize. Very few people are going to show up at work the next day and go, hey, will you pour me a cup of coffee? By the way, I was abducted, sexually molested, and possibly implanted with a alien-human hybrid egg, and we'll find out in 9 months when I'm abducted again.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
I mean, people don't just talk about that. So there are far more abductees than we realize. But secondly, they're far more normal. Now, there is another very important book written by David M. Jacobs as well called Walking Among Us, the Alien Plan to Control Humanity. And let me read just a little bit of what he says about these abductees. He says many abductees are successful, high-functioning individuals with advanced professional degrees who risk their reputation and livelihoods by relating their experience. Abductees come from all strata of society. Among them are physicians, business people, attorneys, psychologists, psychiatrists, scientists, university professors, graduate students, police officers, librarians, retailers, laborers, retirees, and even the unemployed. They all face ridicule and scorn when they claim they were abducted by extraterrestrial beings, but they are all clinging to their story as a real event in real time and space that took place to them. Jacobs goes on to write that the abduction phenomenon does not lend itself to facile answers. Here are some of the aspects of reported abductions that must be accounted for in the explanation. When people are abducted, they are physically missing from their normal environment. Now, that is something that you see reported over and over. Spouses have reported their spouse missing in the bed, waking up to find them gone. There's the famous story of Travis Walton, and we took some pictures. We'll show them to you. The famous story of Travis Walton out in Eber, Arizona, who claimed to be missing for 5 days. Some people argue that it was a hoax, but nonetheless, what he claimed lines up with what many people talk about. Not only that, but Jacobs writes, people are sometimes abducted in groups and can confirm each other's reports. One of the great group abductions coming down the road is going to be the rapture. And how that will be spun by those left behind will be very interesting, especially given this growing phenomenon. Bystanders sometimes see people being abducted. When returned to their normal environment after an abduction, people often have marks, cuts, bruises, broken bones, and even fully formed scars, a biological impossibility given the time. When people return, people sometimes have their clothes on inside out or backward, or they are wearing someone else's clothes. In these cases, they clearly remember themselves dressed before they were abducted. Most of what abductees describe has no antecedent in popular culture. The abduction phenomenon, Jacobs writes, cuts across all social, political, religious, educational, intellectual, and racial lines. Not only that, but the abduction phenomenon cuts across geographic lines. Doesn't matter whether you're in Africa or in America. Doesn't matter whether you're an Eskimo or whether you're a redneck from Mississippi. It is the same pattern all across the world. Abductions occur at all times of the day and night, depending on access to the abductees and when they will be least missed. Abductions begin in childhood and continue with varying frequencies into old age. The abduction phenomenon is intergenerational, again, very spiritual in its phrasing. The children of abductees, often themselves being reported as abductees, as do their children. Abductions are unrelated to alcohol or drugs. And one of the things that Jacobs talks about of equal importance is how abductees deal with the phenomenon. Most abductees fear abductions and want them to stop. They do not revel in them. He goes on to say that some are able to remember large parts, others not. But it is an ongoing reality that is growing day by day. Now, as already mentioned, Jacobs, who is not some fly-by-night character, states this. He says, I contend that the hybridization of aliens with humans, and perhaps other aliens, is the key to understanding the abduction phenomenon. This is a controversial hypothesis within an already controversial subject, but I will present information in this book that will add substance to my contention. All hybrids are created to perform specific functions. They all work constantly. Most do not sleep as long as humans do, but humanoid hybrids and perhaps even greys go into shorter sleep-like states. They all have the same neurological abilities in varying degrees of strength. They all communicate telepathically. They all give complete allegiance to their insectalians. And as hybrids become more human, we can see a progression of human features that the greys do not seem to need. In other words, to use a Bible term, it's as if somebody is sowing tares among the wheat. Now, these abduction cases are not a 20th or 21st century phenomenon. There's a great article that states vanished people who met strange entities and then reappeared mysteriously. Lest you watch this and think, well, this is kind of a 20th century, 21st century type of situation, it's not the case. The article states cases of mysterious disappearances are already strange enough as it is. But sometimes there's an extra layer of the bizarre laid over everything. In some cases, those who have vanished without a trace come back, and they often do so with odd tales to tell. Here, we will look at some very weird such cases which involve signs that these individuals have been pulled into another world during their vanishing to interact with forces beyond our understanding. The article goes on to state, in May of 1753, a respected local craftsman and gardener in the town of Tacconi in Sicily, Italy, by the name of Alberto Gordoni, was allegedly walking through the town square when he suddenly and inexplicably completely vanished into thin air right before the eyes of numerous stunned witnesses. When the area was searched, there could be found no sign of Gordoni, and there were no grooves or hollow pits that he could have fallen through. It was as if he just ceased to exist, as if he just walked out of one dimension and into another, which is exactly what it would look like if you were on a two-dimensional plane and you saw a three-dimensional being pass through. Or if you and I, living in our three dimension, were to walk out of the three-dimensional plane into the fourth dimension. It was as if he had just ceased to exist, the article states. And as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months and into years with no sign of the missing man, the town seemed to almost forget about him. However, it would seem that he was not really gone after all. Exactly 22 years after his disappearance, Gordoni allegedly reappeared out of nowhere in the same exact spot from which he had vanished, seemingly without having aged so much as a day. Now, it's interesting to think about this. If, and it's a big if, but if this story is true, it begs the question how those in the other dimension relate to our time-space dimension. For example, if you were to die today, given the prophetic timeline, you have like 7 years. Let's say it takes another 5 years to get to the rapture, another 7 years of tribulation, and then 1,000 years, that kind of thing like that. Would you sense time, or if you die today, would the rapture be like tomorrow, a matter of seconds? Does time compress? We don't know. Or what about someone who died 500 years ago? Does it feel like an endless day to them, or simply a blink of the eye and here we are? There is an interesting book by Paradox Brown that I highly recommend you read. It uses the example of a chalkboard and a line being drawn from left to right. Imagine a chalkboard and this line going across it from left to right. Now, the book talks about the ability of the other side, beings in the other dimension, have the ability to bend that dimension. Whereas you and I simply can draw the line flat on the board from left to right or right to left, they can actually bring it out and bend it out into the 3D. The line does not go forward, it does not go back. It doesn't move in time. It goes as far out. And let's say the line is 3 feet on the board from left to right. Well, let's say it bends out. Now watch me. What if it bends out 3,000 miles from that point on the board? 3,000 miles would take a long time to get back. But when it got back, where would it be on the two-dimensional line on the board? He would be at the same spot. For someone in that line going out, it may feel like that time transference and space transference going 3,000 miles. But for someone on the two dimension, it would not, and they would return right to the same spot. Is this something akin to what it feels like when we leave this life and enter into the spiritual dimension? Now, we return back to the article talking about Gordoni. When asked what had happened to him and where he had been for so long, Gordoni insisted that he had not disappeared. And to him it seemed as if no time had passed at all. Years would pass before eventually he confided in a local priest by the name of Father Mario to tell of what had really happened to him. According to Gordoni, on the day that he disappeared, he had come across a strange, glimmering tunnel and gone into it and been drawn into it. Alberto suddenly got into the tunnel and it took him to what he called a white, ambiguous world. There were no items that he could recognize, only what seemed to be fancy accessories. Alberto saw something similar on small canvas covered in stars and dots, each of which throbbed in its own way. There was one long creature with long hair. Very interesting, because the Bible describes the demons in the book of Revelation with the face of a woman, the hair of a man. This being with long hair said that he had fell into a crack of space and time, and that he would deliver him back, but it would be very difficult. While Alberto waited for his return, and he fervently asked to be brought back, the entity told him about holes which open in the dark, about some white drops and thoughts that move at the speed of light, about the soul without the flesh and body without the soul, about flying cities and eternally young inhabitants. He had been finally returned to the spot that he had been to originally. But for him, very little time had passed, certainly not 22 years. Father Mario was apparently convinced that Gordoni was telling the truth and took him back to the spot to see what would happen, to investigate and see if they could find this. As they were there, Gordoni purportedly vanished into thin air once more, this time never to be seen again. Father Mario then crossed himself, ordered the location to be fenced in, calling it the trap of the devil. Was this some force from another planet or even a dimension, or a wildly concocted story? It's also interesting to think about it when you take into account such cases as David Pilates and the missing 411, Mount Shasta, or the Bermuda Triangle, and other such sites. And there are areas around the world, areas where there seem to be holes in the dimension connected to the next. There are also areas within the Bible where it seems to be that the other dimension seems to come in contact easier, more powerfully, and more profoundly than normal. It was on Mount Moriah where Abraham encountered God, Mount Sinai where Moses encountered God. Elijah encountered God on Mount Sinai, hearing the still small voice, and some believe it was the Apostle Paul who actually went to Mount Sinai where he received the revelation of the New Testament church. What about Christ on the Mount of Transfiguration, who quite possibly time traveled, as one of our staff here at the Soul Trap speculated at a meeting the other day? And what about Christ on the Mount of Olives, being received up into a cloud? What about Jacob's ladders and the Bible speaking about windows in heaven during the time of Noah and the flood? Is the other side a distant and non-connected reality as we think? Or is it close? Are there certain spots, certain leylands, certain sacred areas where holes between our world and the next open up? Are abduction cases simply wild-eyed fantasies of people that drink too much and have too active an imagination? Or is there something going on, a threat, a phenomenon, a stacking of the deck against the time to come? An attempted abduction by possible aliens or interdimensional interlopers seems to fit well with many of the cases, with many of the explanations, for there is no other explanation. Is it possible that we have been locked in this horizontal view for so long that we have missed the secret world of the vertical? While we have been focused on the wheat, an enemy has crept into our world and sown their tares among us. And soon, very soon, we are going to see the full fruition of the hybrid breeding program.
You better pray to the Lord when you see those flying saucers. It may be the coming of the judgment day. It's a sign, there's no doubt, of the trouble that's about. So I say, my friend, you'd better start to pray. They're a terrifying sight as they fly on day and night. It's a warning that we'd better mend our ways. You'd better pray to the Lord when you see those flying saucers.
Two local men confronted authorities with a rather bizarre story. Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker told of a strange craft landing near their fishing site and of being taken aboard by three unearthly creatures. The two men were questioned under hypnosis and lie detectors, but their story remained intact.
And typically starseeds are here to help humanity. So when we incarnate as humans, we're here to really help humans remember what it's like to be human and connect to their innateness, their natural senses, rather than distract and go, oh, look at the interdimensions and the other planets. Our role is not to make you look outside of humanity. It's to actually connect back to who you really were. And
many people think the saucers might be someone's foolish dream, or maybe they were sent down here from Mars. If you just stop and think, you'd realize just what it means. They're more than atom bombs or falling stars. And though the war may be through, there's unrest and trouble brewing, and those flying soldiers may be just a sign that if peace doesn't come, it will be the end of some. So repent today, you're running out of time. When you see a saucer fly like a comet through the sky, you should realize the price you'll have to pay. You'd better pray to the Lord when you see those flying saucers. It may be the dawning of the judgment day.